Again, this is Emily from EmbellishedAngelsDesigns.com, and this tutorial I'm going to walk you through kind of a quick tour of the software that I use to create digital scrapbooking layouts, and I actually use the full version of Photoshop. There's two versions of Photoshop. The full version, I'm using CS3. It stands for Creative Suite 3. It's actually now available all the way up to CS5, and I think CS6 is coming out this year. It's kind of on my wish list. The full Photoshop program is quite spendy. It's intended to be used by graphic artists who do this for a living and get paid to create awesome things in Photoshop. So it is pretty expensive. Really the only reason I have it is it was provided to me with one of my other jobs. So I probably would not have purchased this on my own. Yet it is definitely a wish list to upgrade though to CS6 when it comes out. But the other option you have is Photoshop started getting wind that a lot of people were trying to use Photoshop to digitally scrapbook. And they came out with a couple years ago a program called Photoshop Elements. And what that is they took all the pieces from the full version of Photoshop and kind of pared them down to the ones that a scrapbooker or someone who likes to edit their pictures and maybe make birthday invitations, kind of those basic things. And they gave you pretty much just the tools you would need in an interface that was not as intimidating as the full Photoshop. Because the full version of Photoshop has a pretty steep learning curve. It can be very scary to look at. Layers freak people out. There's a lot of different tools and a lot of tools that you probably would never even need to use as a digital scrapbooker. But they kind of fixed that a little bit with Photoshop Elements. I'm just going to open Photoshop Elements here so you can see the difference between the two, how they look different. But in this tutorial, I'm actually going to walk you through the full version of Photoshop, only because that's what I use and I'm much more familiar with it as a scrapbooker. But Photoshop Elements is an awesome option. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you the best part. It's $100. That's still not like totally cheap, but it's way better than full version of Photoshop, which is like $1,700. But this is basically what you see when you open up Photoshop Elements. And it's going to look a little bit different than the full version. It's a different color. It has a background here, which you can change. But the layout is similar. On the left here, you have all your tools and your colors. Across the top, you have your options for all your tools. And over here on the right, you have all your palettes, the layers palette being the one you'll use the most. One of the main differences between Adobe Photoshop Elements and the full version of Photoshop is Elements has something down here called a project bin, and everything you open, every file you open and every file you're working on shows up down here in this bin. And I actually love that feature of Photoshop Elements. The full version of Photoshop doesn't have that. And whenever I go back to scrapbooking in Elements, I'm always like, oh, that's right. I love the photo bin or the project bin. So this is a really nice place to start. The tutorials I'm going to show you are done in full version of Photoshop, but they're essentially the same. All the tools are the same. They can do a lot of the same things. The reason why I chose to do my own scrapbooking in the full version of Photoshop is there are a few tools that you can't use in Photoshop Elements that as I progressed in my knowledge about scrapbooking, I wanted to be able to use, so I switched to the full version. But Photoshop Elements is an awesome place to start. So I'm going to switch over here to the full version of Photoshop, and you'll see right away that it looks different than Photoshop Elements, but also kind of looks the same. And I'll give you kind of a tour of the main things that you're going to need to be able to identify in Photoshop. And you can see right away my background of my desktop is still showing because Photoshop doesn't put anything in the background until you have a document up. So I'm going to take you and we're going to start here on the left, and these are the tools that you are going to be using to create a layout. And if you hover over any of them, it will give you a little box and tell you what the tool is. And then if a tool has one of these little arrows, if you click and hold it, other tools are hidden underneath that tool. So again, you just kind of click and hold, and the other tools that are hidden underneath there will pop out, and then you can select whichever one you want. The tools that you'll probably use the most, the tools that I use the most on the side here, number one is the move tool. Anytime you want to move a layer around, switch something, put it in front or behind, whatever, you're going to want the move tool. And the move tool is one of those things where when I was first learning to digitally scrapbook and I was over here on my document and I was trying to do something and the computer kept making that error noise, that kind of durr noise, and I'd be frustrated, like, what's going on? Well, sure enough, I wasn't on my move tool. That was the problem 99% of the time. So if you're running into that and you're like, why won't it do it? It's probably because you need to have your move tool selected. You use that one all the time. The second most common thing that I use in scrapbooking is my brush tool, which is right here. And if you hover over it, says brush tool. Brushes in Photoshop for digital scrapbooking are just hands down the coolest thing to use. You can just do so many cool things with brushes. And then the other thing that I probably use right up there is the text tool. And again, you can click and hold, and you have a horizontal type tool to vertical, so you can write up and down, use it all the time. And then I often use the rectangular tool to get shapes and stuff. And in one of the layouts that I'm going to show you how to do, we will use the shape tool to create some items. Some other ones here, those are the most common ones, but you will want to crop sometimes. Some of these other ones I just don't use. I do use the eraser tool at times. Down here at the bottom here is your colors. So this is where you get to choose which color you're using, and I'll show you how to use that in the layout as well. The default is black and white, but you'll be able to, I'll show you how to use that when we make the layout. So when you choose a tool, options for that tool show up here. So whatever tool you have, the things you can change about it are up here. And for like the move tool, there's certain things you can select or unselect or deselect. Let's go to the type tool, same thing. You can choose your font, your size, left aligned, centered, color. That's where all your options, this is called your options bar for there. So besides the tools, the other most important thing in Photoshop is Photoshop functions in layers. So this is your layers palette. And layers, you have to kind of think of them as exactly like you do in traditional scrapbooking, that if you were sitting at a table and you were to put a piece of paper down, that would be your bottom layer. And then everything you put on top of that, picture, frame, another piece of paper, those all become layers on top of that bottom layer. And that's exactly how Photoshop works with layers. So I'm going to open a document so you can see the layers here. It's going to seem like a lot. Don't let it freak you out. I just want you to be able to see some actual layers. And I got to think here for a sec where this is at. Here we go. I'm going to open up the Photoshop file of the layout that we're going to be doing. And it's reading the format, and it's going to open it up and place it right here. And then you're going to see my layers palette pop up on the right. And it basically is just going to show you what's the bottom layer and what's every layer on top of that. And everything you create in Photoshop comes in as a layer. Every shape you make, every button, every ribbon, every picture, it's a layer in Photoshop. So you can rearrange layers, change their order, whatever you need to do. The layers palette is where you're going to want to do it. So this is the layout that we're going to be creating, and you'll see over here popped up a lot of layers. Starting way down on the bottom, here's our background layer. Then right above that is our paper layer that's this gorgeous kind of rose floral. And then every layer going up is in the layers palette. And they're exactly the same as they're underneath each other. So like this layer right here, this picture layer is on top of this picture layer. And this one is on top of this layer. So and you can control that by rearranging your layers over here in the layers palette. So part of becoming a good digital scrapbooker, you have to understand layers. That's where the action happens. That's where all your elements are put in and where you rearrange them and you work with them. So you have to understand layers. So again, the basic Photoshop tour, you've got your tools over here, and I talked about the most commonly used ones. Here's your options bar where you'll change your tools, and then over here, layers, where you're going to be putting all your elements and creating your layout. So that's the next step that we'll do, is we're going to jump in and create the basic pieces of our first digital layout. Check it out.